Hello everyone, I am the Boring Historian and I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. For millennia, popular imagination has cast the pharaohs of ancient Egypt as the epitome of absolute power and luxury. Draped in gold, commanding vast armies, and worshipped as living gods, these god-kings appear in our collective consciousness as figures who enjoyed privileges beyond mortal comprehension. Modern films, novels, and even academic narratives have often reinforced this perception, presenting pharaonic rule as the ultimate expression of unchecked authority and indulgence. Yet this gilded image conceals a far more complex and often harsh reality. The golden masks that covered the faces of deceased pharaohs serve as an apt metaphor for how our understanding of their lives has been obscured by layers of misconception and simplification. Behind these masks existed individuals who, despite their divine status, faced extraordinary pressures and challenges unique to their position. This historical narrative seeks to shatter the persistent myth of pharaonic omnipotence and unbridled luxury by exploring the harsh, often overlooked realities of life as a divine ruler in ancient Egypt. Through examination of archaeological evidence, medical studies of royal mummies, ancient texts, and contemporary historical analysis, we will reveal a picture of pharaonic existence that contradicts popular perceptions, one marked by constant pressure, political danger, burdensome divine expectations, physical suffering, and profound isolation. The pharaohs were indeed powerful beyond measure by the standards of their time, but that very power came with costs equally immense. Their divinity was not merely a privilege but a burden that shaped every aspect of their lives from birth to death, and an Egyptian belief beyond. The throne of Egypt was as much a prison as it was a seat of authority, binding its occupant to expectations and restrictions that ordinary Egyptians could scarcely imagine. As we peel back the layers of gold and myth that have accumulated around these ancient rulers, we will discover not invincible god-kings, but human beings navigating extraordinary circumstances. Individuals whose lives were defined as much by constraint as by freedom, as much by obligation as by privilege, and as much by suffering as by splendor. Long before a prince took his place upon the throne of Egypt, the foundations of his future burden had been established through centuries of theological development. The concept of pharaonic rule in ancient Egypt was inextricably bound to religious belief, creating a framework that would dictate virtually every aspect of the king's existence. Far from granting unlimited freedom, this divine status imposed extraordinary restrictions and expectations that few modern people could comprehend. The pharaoh was not merely a ruler with religious significance. He was the literal embodiment of divine power on earth, the living Horus, son of Osiris, and the crucial link between the mortal and divine realms. This theological position carried profound implications. Unlike monarchs in many other ancient societies who claimed divine favor or descent, the Egyptian pharaoh was not simply connected to the gods. He was in essence a god himself walking among humans. This divine nature represented not freedom, but profound obligation. The pharaoh did not merely serve his people, he served the cosmic order itself, Ma'at, the fundamental balance and harmony of the universe. Every action, decision, and aspect of his being was evaluated against this cosmic standard. The maintenance of Ma'at was not optional, but the core purpose of his existence. Should he fail in this sacred duty, the consequences would extend beyond political instability to cosmic calamity. The Egyptian understanding of kingship developed over millennia, with each dynasty adding layers of complexity to the already burdensome role. From the earliest dynastic periods, the king was understood as the mediator between heaven and earth. By the height of pharaonic power during the New Kingdom, this theological framework had evolved into an intricate system that dictated virtually every aspect of the ruler's life. Religious texts from the Pyramid Age through the late period consistently emphasized the pharaoh's sacred duties rather than his privileges. The instructions for Merakar, dating to the turbulent First Intermediate Period, circa 2081 to 555 BCE, admonishes the king, "Do justice whilst thou endureth upon earth. Quiet the weeper, do not oppress the widow, supplant no man in the property of his father, take heed to thyself against punishment." Such instructions make clear that the pharaoh's divine power came with divine responsibility. His role was not to indulge personal desires, but to embody perfect conduct as befitting a living God. Every deviation from ideal behavior risked not merely political consequences, but divine punishment and cosmic disorder. From birth, those destined for the throne were raised with constant reminders of their future sacred obligations. Education for royal children emphasized not just practical governance, but theological correctness and ritual precision. Future pharaohs learned that their words would have the weight of divine command. Their actions would affect the flow of the Nile, and their very thoughts might influence the success of crops or the prevention of natural disasters. Perhaps most tellingly, the Egyptian conception of the afterlife for pharaohs carried the same burdens as earthly rule. While common Egyptians hoped for peaceful existence in the field of reeds after successfully passing judgment, the pharaoh's afterlife involved continued cosmic responsibilities. Death brought no release from duty, only its transformation into an eternal obligation to maintain ma'at from the divine realm. The theological framework surrounding the pharaoh created what might be described as a divine prison, a set of expectations, restrictions, and sacred duties from which there was no escape, either in life or death. The god-king served the gods more profoundly than any priest, bound by obligations that extended to every aspect of existence. Far from granting unlimited license, divinity imposed unlimited responsibility. This fundamental theological reality established the foundation for all other aspects of pharaonic burden. Political power, social position, material wealth, all were ultimately subservient to the religious imperatives that defined the very nature of Egyptian kingship. To understand the true experience of being pharaoh, we must first acknowledge this inescapable divine obligation that colored every other aspect of royal life. The pharaoh's body was not his own. Unlike even the humblest of his subjects who could move, rest, and conduct themselves according to personal preference, the king's physical form belonged to the state and to the gods. Every aspect of the royal body was subject to ritual requirements and symbolic significance that transformed even the most basic physical experiences into matters of cosmic importance. From the moment a new day began, the king's body underwent elaborate purification rituals that could consume hours before any state business could commence. The opening of the mouth ceremony, typically associated with funerary practices, had living counterparts in daily royal ritual. The pharaoh's mouth, eyes, and limbs required ritual activation each morning to ensure their divine efficacy. Far from mere ceremony, these daily requirements were considered essential to maintaining cosmic order. Contemporary accounts from royal attendants, preserved in tomb biographies, reveal the exhausting physical demands of these rituals. One inscription from the tomb of Amenhotep, 18th dynasty, describes the attendant's duty. "I purified the body of His Majesty 4 times before dawn, with water from the sacred pool, with natron from the divine house, with incense from the temple stores. No sleep came to my eyes until His Majesty was ready to embody Horus for another day. The pharaoh's diet was similarly constrained by ritual requirements. Contrary to popular imagination, the king could not simply indulge in whatever foods appealed to his personal taste. Certain foods were prescribed for particular days and seasons, while others were permanently forbidden. The pure food, required for the king's consumption, necessitated elaborate preparation rituals that transformed eating from pleasure to sacred duty. Archaeological evidence from royal mummies confirms the physical toll these dietary restrictions and prescriptions took on pharaonic health. Examination of numerous royal mummies has revealed severe dental problems, obesity, and arteriosclerosis among many pharaohs. Rather than enjoying the finest nutrition, many rulers suffered from highly restricted diets rich in carbohydrates and sugars, while lacking essential nutrients. The mummy of Amenhotep III shows evidence of severe dental abscesses that would have caused extreme pain during his later years, a condition likely exacerbated by a ritually prescribed diet heavy in honey and bread. Perhaps most burdensome were the requirements concerning the pharaoh's sexual function. Far from the harem-based excesses depicted in popular media, royal sexuality was governed by religious calendars and ritual necessity. The king's sexual activities were scheduled according to astronomical and religious considerations, with particular emphasis on the pharaoh's duty to demonstrate fertility at specific festivals and ceremonies. These obligations existed regardless of personal desire, physical condition, or emotional state. The physical appearance of the pharaoh was similarly bound by theological requirements rather than personal preference. Royal regalia, the crowns, scepters, ceremonial beard, and elaborate costumes were not merely decorative, but ritually significant objects weighing several pounds. These had to be worn for hours during ceremonies, regardless of Egypt's punishing heat. The famous images of pharaohs in perfect, youthful form represented theological ideals rather than physical reality, creating additional pressure to maintain a divine appearance despite human limitations. Even the pharaoh's natural biological functions were subject to ritual control. Records indicate elaborate procedures surrounding royal urination and defecation, with attendants required to collect, examine, and sometimes preserve bodily waste for religious purposes. What would be private for ordinary Egyptians became matters of state importance for the king, whose body was understood as a vessel of divine power. Perhaps most telling is the evidence from royal mummies themselves, which frequently show signs of physical stress inconsistent with lives of luxury and ease. The mummy of Ramesses II, one of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs, reveals severe arthritis, dental disease, and hardened arteries that would have caused significant pain in his later years. Yet royal obligation would have required him to continue appearing in public ceremonies, displaying the strength and vitality expected of a living god. The divine body of the pharaoh, far from being a source of privilege, became the primary site of his burden. Every physical function, sensation, and limitation was subject to religious interpretation and ritual requirement. The king's body belonged not to the man, but to the office, transformed into a living temple whose primary occupant, the pharaoh himself, was bound by its strictures more completely than anyone else in Egyptian society. Perhaps no aspect of pharaonic burden remains more obscured than the profound psychological and emotional constraints imposed by divine kingship. Behind the impassive faces carved in stone and painted on temple walls existed human beings subject to the full range of human emotions: fear, doubt, grief, and anxiety. Yet unlike their subjects, pharaohs were forbidden from displaying these natural responses to life's challenges. The concept of royal decorum, Egyptian chehenet, demanded that the pharaoh maintain perfect composure and divine detachment regardless of circumstances. This wasn't merely court etiquette, but religious necessity. Any display of common emotion might suggest the king was subject to human weaknesses, undermining his divine status and potentially threatening cosmic order. This requirement for emotional perfection created what modern psychologists would recognize as extraordinary cognitive dissonance. The strain of maintaining an external persona radically disconnected from internal experience. While ordinary Egyptians could express grief at funerals, fear during disasters, or joy during celebrations, the pharaoh was required to embody unshakable divine constancy. The psychological burden this imposed can be glimpsed through rare textual evidence of moments when this mask slipped. After the death of his beloved wife Nefertiti, Akhenaten, r. 353-1336 BCE, commissioned commemorative texts that hint at personal grief, otherwise inadmissible in royal contexts. My heart stirs in its place when I recall your beauty. Though you have gone to where all go, my soul remains bound to what was. Such rare expressions of human emotion represent extraordinary departures from royal protocol. More commonly, the psychological strain of maintaining divine perfection was channeled into acceptable symbolic forms. The smiting of enemies, ritual hunts, and military campaigns served as sanctioned outlets for emotions that could not be directly expressed. These ritualized activities allowed for controlled emotional release within religiously acceptable parameters. The requirement for perfect control extended to the pharaoh's speech as well. Royal pronouncements were believed to have creative power, the ability to manifest reality through divine word. This theological concept, known as Heka, meant that casual conversation was impossible for the king. Every utterance carried cosmic significance, requiring careful consideration before speaking. Records of court proceedings suggest that pharaohs often communicated through intermediaries, rather than risk direct speech that might be interpreted as divine command. This isolation behind a mask of perfection was further compounded by the physical reality of royal existence. The pharaoh was rarely, if ever, truly alone. Attended constantly by servants, priests, and officials, the king nevertheless experienced profound emotional isolation, unable to form normal human connections due to his divine status. Even relationships with immediate family were mediated through elaborate protocol that reinforced the king's separation from normal human experience. Perhaps most psychologically burdensome was the pharaoh's responsibility for national failures beyond his control. When natural disasters struck, drought, famine, plague, these were interpreted as signs of divine displeasure with the king. The theological position that made the pharaoh responsible for cosmic harmony also made him personally culpable for cosmic disorder. Evidence from the first intermediate period suggests that the collapse of central authority was preceded by environmental catastrophe that was interpreted as divine judgment on failed kingship. The constant need to project perfection while absorbing blame for factors beyond human control created psychological pressures unique to pharaonic existence. These pressures occasionally found expression in religious innovations that hint at underlying psychological strain. Akhenaten's religious revolution, abandoning traditional gods in favor of the At, has been interpreted by some scholars as a response to the impossible burdens of traditional pharaonic theology, an attempt to redefine divine kingship in terms that might allow greater human expression. Archaeological evidence occasionally provides glimpses of the person behind the mask. The famous golden mask of Tutankhamun presents an idealized, perfect face to eternity. Yet CT scans of his mummy reveal a young man with physical abnormalities, including a cleft palate and slightly malformed foot, who died before reaching 20. The contrast between the mask's perfection and the physical reality of the boy king powerfully symbolizes the gap between pharaonic image and experience. The psychological burden of maintaining divine perfection represents perhaps the most profound yet least visible aspect of pharaonic suffering. Behind every impassive royal image stood a human being, denied the most basic forms of emotional expression and human connection, imprisoned in a mask of perfection that could never be removed, even in private moments of greatest vulnerability. Modern examination of royal mummies has shattered the image of pharaohs as paragons of physical health and vitality. Far from enjoying superior physical condition due to their privileged status, many Egyptian rulers suffered from severe health problems that were often exacerbated rather than alleviated by their royal position. These physical challenges reveal a stark contrast between the idealized representations of pharaohs in official art and the biological reality of their existence. Perhaps the most surprising discovery from mummy examinations has been the prevalence of obesity and related conditions among many pharaohs. CT scans and other analysis of royal remains from various dynasties reveal that many rulers suffered from serious obesity, contrary to their slender, athletic depictions in official art. Amenhotep III, Ramesses II, and numerous other pharaohs show evidence of significant weight problems in their later years. This pattern of obesity appears linked to the restricted, carbohydrate-heavy royal diet. Despite access to the kingdom's resources, pharaonic meals were determined more by ritual requirements than nutritional considerations. The royal diet typically centered on bread, honey, and beer, or wine, a combination that modern nutritionists would immediately identify as problematic. This diet, combined with the increasingly sedentary nature of royal duties, created conditions ideal for weight gain and its associated health problems. Cardiovascular disease features prominently in studies of pharaonic health. Examination of royal mummies using modern medical imaging has revealed widespread evidence of atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries among ancient Egyptian rulers. The mummy of Amenhotep II, 18th dynasty, shows clear signs of coronary artery disease that would have caused significant health problems. Similarly, examination of Merempta's mummy, 19th dynasty, revealed extensive arterial calcification that would have severely impacted his physical capacity in later years. Dental health represents another area where pharaohs suffered disproportionately. The royal diet, particularly its high concentration of honey and other sweet substances, led to severe dental problems. Many royal mummies show evidence of multiple abscesses, extreme wear, and tooth loss. The mummy of Amenhotep III reveals dental issues so severe that they would have caused chronic pain and potentially life-threatening infections. These conditions would have been particularly problematic given the pharaoh's public role, which required speaking clearly during ceremonies and maintaining a divine appearance. Parasitic infections, common throughout ancient Egypt, affected pharaohs despite their privileged status. Examination of Nakhtenk's mummy, a noble rather than pharaoh but indicative of elite health, revealed infection with multiple parasites, including schistosoma bilharzia, which remains endemic in Egypt today. Evidence suggests that royal bathing rituals, which often involved sacred pools with standing water, may have actually increased exposure to waterborne parasites rather than promoting health. The mummy of Ramesses II shows clear evidence of smallpox, making him potentially the earliest confirmed case of this disease in history. Other royal mummies reveal evidence of malaria, tuberculosis, and various inflammatory conditions. The common assumption that royal status would have protected pharaohs from such infections appears unfounded. In some cases, ritual requirements may have increased their exposure to pathogens. Joint disease and mobility issues frequently appear in examinations of pharaonic remains. Rameses II's mummy shows severe arthritis that would have made movement painful in his later years. Similarly, Siptah's mummy reveals evidence of poliomyelitis, resulting in a clubfoot that would have significantly impacted his ability to perform ceremonial functions requiring long periods of standing or movement. Genetic health challenges also affected many pharaonic lines, particularly in dynasties that practiced close consanguineous marriage. The most famous example comes from the 18th dynasty, where CT scans of Tutankhamun's mummy revealed multiple congenital issues likely resulting from inbreeding, including a cleft palate and clubfoot. These genetic factors created additional physical challenges beyond those imposed by diet and lifestyle. Perhaps most significant is evidence of how pharaonic medical treatments often compounded rather than relieved these conditions. The royal position provided access to the most advanced medical care in the ancient world, yet examination of royal mummies reveals that these treatments frequently caused additional problems. Evidence of trepanation, skull drilling, harsh purgatives, and toxic mineral-based remedies appears in various royal remains, suggesting treatments that would have caused significant suffering without therapeutic benefit. These physical ailments must be understood within the context of royal obligation. Unlike ordinary Egyptians who might rest when ill or injured, pharaohs were expected to maintain an active ceremonial schedule regardless of physical condition. Royal duty demanded participation in strenuous ceremonies, public appearances, and ritual activities, even when suffering from debilitating conditions. The pharaoh's divine status paradoxically denied him the basic human consideration of convalescence. The contrast between idealized artistic representations and physical reality reveals a poignant aspect of pharaonic burden. While temple walls and statues depicted the king with perfect physique and health, the body of a god, the man behind these images often suffered from conditions that would challenge even those without royal responsibilities. The physical reality of pharaonic existence thus becomes another dimension in which the privilege of kingship translated into unique forms of suffering. Popular imagination envisions pharaohs enjoying the finest cuisine ancient Egypt could provide, exotic delicacies, the freshest produce, and the choicest meats served by attentive staff. Archaeological evidence, however, reveals a dietary reality far removed from this fantasy. The pharaonic diet, shaped by religious requirements and cultural traditions, often proved actively harmful to royal health and contributed significantly to the physical suffering many rulers endured. Analysis of royal mummies has consistently revealed patterns of nutritional disease inconsistent with optimal diet. Far from enjoying balanced nutrition, many pharaohs show evidence of specific deficiencies alongside problems of excess. This paradoxical combination, malnutrition amid abundance, resulted from dietary practices governed by ritual rather than health considerations. The foundation of the royal diet, like that of most Egyptians, was bread. However, pharaonic bread differed significantly from common varieties. Royal loaves were often made from the finest ground flour, which removed most of the grain's nutritional fiber and mineral content. Additionally, examination of residue from preserved royal food offerings reveals that royal bread frequently contains sweeteners like honey and fruit, further reducing its nutritional value while increasing carbohydrate content. Honey featured prominently in the pharaonic diet, considered appropriate for divine consumption due to its connection with solar symbolism and preservation properties. Royal tombs frequently contained honey pots still preserved millennia later, and texts reference honey's importance in royal meals. While modern research recognizes certain beneficial properties in honey, its excessive consumption, particularly combined with other carbohydrates, contributed to obesity, dental disease, and possibly diabetes among many pharaohs. Wine consumption represented another problematic aspect of royal diet. Unlike beer, which was consumed by Egyptians of all classes, wine held special significance for the elite and particularly for pharaonic ritual. Analysis of residue from royal wine jars reveals not only the expected grape content, but also various additives including resins, herbs, and sweeteners that may have increased both its intoxicating properties and potential health impacts. The regular consumption of these enhanced wines likely contributed to liver disease evident in several royal mummies. Meat, often assumed to be a staple of royal diet, appeared on the pharaonic table primarily in ritual contexts rather than daily meals. When served, it came bound by strict religious prescriptions regarding which animals were appropriate for royal consumption and how they must be prepared. These requirements often resulted in preservation methods involving heavy salting or the addition of natron, which created high-sodium foods linked to the cardiovascular problems evident in many royal remains. Perhaps most significantly, the concept of pure food for royal consumption imposed severe limitations on dietary variety. Foods deemed appropriate for divine consumption were restricted to a narrow range that excluded many nutritionally valuable options available even to common Egyptians. Archaeological evidence from non-royal settlements reveals a greater variety of legumes, vegetables, and fish than appears in royal contexts, suggesting that ordinary Egyptians may have enjoyed more diverse nutrition than their divine rulers. The consequences of this restricted diet appear clearly in medical examinations of royal mummies. The mummy of Hatshepsut, recently identified through DNA testing, shows evidence of diabetes and obesity. Similarly, Amenhotep III's remains reveal severe dental abscesses and evidence of metabolic disorders consistent with nutritional imbalance. Ramesses Tek, who lived into his 90s, nonetheless shows signs of severe arterial disease likely exacerbated by his diet. These dietary problems were compounded by eating patterns dictated by ritual rather than physical need. Royal meals followed religious schedules rather than hunger, with certain foods prescribed for particular times of day, specific days of the month, or religious festivals. This rigid timing, disconnected from bodily requirements, likely contributed to digestive problems evident in several pharaonic mummies. The royal table also hosted another, more deliberate danger: poison. The centralization of power in the pharaoh made assassination by poisoning an ongoing threat, particularly during periods of political instability. This danger necessitated elaborate food security measures, including official food tasters and complex serving rituals that transformed meals from pleasure to potential peril. While difficult to confirm in ancient remains, some mummies show evidence of elevated toxic metal levels that may indicate either deliberate poisoning or the unintended consequences of treatments for suspected poisoning. Perhaps most telling is evidence that pharaohs themselves recognized these dietary dangers. Medical papyri from royal collections contain treatments for conditions directly related to elite diet, including remedies for obesity, digestive complaints, and dental problems. The Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus, likely from a royal physician's collection, includes treatments for dietary conditions that would have particularly affected those consuming the pharaonic diet. The restricted, carbohydrate-heavy, and ritually prescribed royal diet reveals another dimension in which pharaonic privilege translated into physical burden. Far from enjoying the best nutrition ancient Egypt could provide, pharaohs consumed foods selected primarily for symbolic and religious significance rather than health value. The resulting nutritional imbalances contributed significantly to the physical suffering evident in royal remains. Another example of how the trappings of divine kingship often harmed rather than benefited those who wore the double crown. The visual splendor of pharaonic appearance represents one of ancient Egypt's most enduring images. The golden crown, ceremonial beard, elaborate jewelry, and distinctive eye makeup have become iconic symbols of royal power. Yet these magnificent trappings imposed physical burdens rarely considered in popular accounts. Far from mere decorative elements, royal regalia represented another dimension of pharaonic suffering. Beautiful to behold, but often agonizing to wear. The crowns of Egypt, the white crown of Upper Egypt, the red crown of Lower Egypt, and the combined double crown, symbolize divine authority and territorial dominion. However, archaeological examination reveals these were substantial objects weighing several pounds. Crafted from leather and metal with elaborate decorative elements, these crowns required significant neck strength to support during lengthy ceremonies. Prolonged wearing would have caused muscle strain, headaches, and potential spinal problems. This physical burden was magnified by the hot climate of Egypt. The crowns, like most royal regalia, provided no ventilation and would have trapped body heat during outdoor ceremonies. Contemporary accounts from royal attendants describe the need to frequently dab the pharaoh's brow during public appearances, suggesting significant discomfort beneath the royal headdress. The ceremonial false beard, another hallmark of pharaonic appearance, attached to the chin with straps that wrapped around the ears and head. This arrangement caused skin irritation and pressure points, particularly during extended wear. Evidence from royal mummies occasionally shows calloused areas consistent with regular pressure from these attachments, indicating a chronic physical irritation endured for symbolic purposes. Royal jewelry, far from the lightweight decorative items of modern fashion, consisted of massive gold collars, bracelets, and pectorals that could weigh 10 to 15 pounds in total. The famous broad collar, uskek, a signature element of pharaonic regalia, distributed considerable weight across the shoulders and upper back. Examination of royal skeletal remains frequently shows stress markers on cervical vertebrae, consistent with regularly bearing such weight. The distinctive Egyptian eye makeup, while visually striking, posed its own physical challenges. Chemical analysis of preserved cosmetic containers from royal tombs reveals that kohl, the black eye paint, contains significant amounts of lead compounds. While offering some protection against eye infection and reducing sun glare, the lead content would have been partially absorbed through the skin, contributing to the heavy metal toxicity evident in some royal remains. Full ceremonial dress included multiple layers of fine linen garments that, while individually lightweight, created considerable insulating effect in Egypt's climate. During important ceremonies, the pharaoh might wear several layers of ritual garments, each with specific symbolic significance. The resulting ensemble restricted movement and increased body temperature significantly, particularly during outdoor ceremonies in direct sunlight. The pharaoh's ceremonial staff and flail, symbols of divine authority, were substantial metal objects that had to be held in precise positions throughout lengthy rituals. Maintaining these postures for hours caused muscle fatigue and joint strain. Some royal mummies show evidence of repetitive stress injuries to wrist and elbow joints, consistent with regularly holding these heavy implements. Royal sandals, crafted from precious materials and adorned with symbolic imagery, often sacrificed comfort for theological correctness. Some ceremonial footwear recovered from royal tombs features flat soles without arch support and restrictive strapping that would have impeded natural walking motion. These design elements, while visually impressive and symbolically appropriate, would have contributed to foot and lower back pain during processions and standing ceremonies. Perhaps most burdensome was the requirement to maintain perfect posture and specific ritual positions while wearing this ensemble. Unlike ordinary Egyptians who could adjust clothing for comfort, the pharaoh's regalia had to be worn exactly as religious protocol demanded. Maintaining the formal postures required for royal ceremonies while bearing this weight represented a significant physical challenge, particularly for rulers already suffering from health conditions. The physical burden of royal regalia was not incidental, but integral to its purpose. The discomfort of wearing these items served as a constant physical reminder of the weight of kingship. This symbolic association appears explicitly in texts describing royal investiture, which often use terms connoting burden and weight when referring to assuming royal regalia. He has taken upon himself the weight of the two lands, or he bears the heavy crown of his father. This understanding transforms our perception of familiar royal imagery. When we see the famous golden mask of Tutankhamun or the colossal statues of Ramesses II adorned with royal regalia, we should recognize not just symbols of power, but instruments of physical burden. The magnificence that projects divine authority to viewers represented, for the pharaoh himself, another dimension of the suffering inherent in embodying a god on earth. The splendor of pharaonic appearance thus reveals itself as yet another beautiful facade concealing physical hardship. Like so many aspects of divine kingship, what appeared as privilege to outside observers translated into unique forms of suffering for those who bore the double crown, a pattern consistent throughout the pharaonic experience. Perhaps no aspect of pharaonic life contradicts popular perception more dramatically than the constant fear of assassination that shadowed even the most powerful kings. Far from enjoying unchallenged security, many pharaohs lived with the knowledge that those closest to them, family members, trusted officials, even personal servants, might at any moment attempt to end their lives and seize their power. Historical evidence confirms that this fear was well-founded. Throughout Egypt's long history, numerous pharaohs met violent ends at the hands of conspirators. The Turin King List, an ancient Egyptian chronicle of rulers, contains telling gaps and notations of kings who ruled for very brief periods, often indicators of successful coups and assassinations concealed in official histories. Archaeological evidence occasionally provides more direct confirmation. The mummy of Ramesses III, 20th dynasty, shows a severe throat wound that was initially concealed by embalmers, revealed only by modern CT scanning. Historical records confirm that this pharaoh was the target of a harem conspiracy organized by one of his secondary wives, Taye, who sought to place her son Pentuer on the throne. While the assassination succeeded, the conspiracy failed. Pentuer appears to have been forced to commit suicide, as indicated by both historical records and examination of a mummy believed to be his. This was not an isolated incident. Evidence suggests that Amenemhat I's 12th dynasty was assassinated in a palace conspiracy, leading to his famous literary testament, warning his son about the dangers of trusting others. Similarly, the rapid succession of rulers at the end of the 19th dynasty suggests a period of violent political instability featuring multiple assassinations, though historical records deliberately obscure these events. The threat came not only from within the palace, but from the broader power structures of Egyptian society. The priesthood, particularly during the later New Kingdom, accumulated power that rivaled the pharaoh's own. The high priests of Amen at Thebes eventually established what amounted to a parallel state in Upper Egypt, leading to the political fragmentation of the third intermediate period. Before this final division, however, tensions between throne and temple created conditions where pharaohs faced potential orchestrated opposition from a powerful religious establishment capable of claiming divine authority for removing an unfavorable king. Even more dangerous was the military, particularly after the expansion of professional fighting forces during the New Kingdom. Horemheb, the last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, rose from military ranks during the tumultuous post-Amarna period. His example established a precedent for military leaders seizing royal power, a pattern that would repeat throughout later Egyptian history. Pharaohs thus faced the delicate challenge of maintaining effective military leadership without creating generals powerful enough to threaten the throne. The pharaoh's own family often represented the most immediate danger. Egyptian succession practices, which lacked a single consistent rule of inheritance, created conditions where multiple royal children might have legitimate claims to the throne. This ambiguity fostered deadly competition among potential heirs, particularly when a pharaoh had children by multiple wives of varying status. Historical records describe numerous succession disputes that turned violent, with siblings eliminating competitors for the crown. In response to these multi-layered threats, pharaohs developed elaborate security measures that significantly constrained their daily lives. Royal food preparation involved multiple stages of supervision to prevent poisoning, the most common method of assassination. Selected officials tasted all food before the king consumed it, literally risking their lives with every royal meal. These precautions transformed dining from pleasure to potential peril, with each dish representing a possible threat. Physical security created further isolation. Trusted bodyguards, often drawn from foreign mercenaries, less entangled in Egyptian power politics, maintained constant surveillance of the royal person. Palace architecture incorporated security features including limited access points, separate chambers for visitors of different status, and private passageways, allowing the king to move without public knowledge. These measures, while providing some protection, reinforced the pharaoh's separation from normal human contact. Perhaps most burdensome was the psychological weight of constant vigilance. Knowing that danger might come from any quarter, pharaohs lived in a state of perpetual wariness. This psychological strain appears in royal texts that emphasize the king's salation and the treacherous nature of those around him. The instruction of Amenemhat, purportedly written by the assassinated king's ghost, advises, "Trust no brother, know no friend, make no intimates. It is worthless. When you lie down, guard your heart yourself, for no man has adherents on the day of woe." This paranoia profoundly shaped pharaonic experience. Unable to fully trust anyone, many rulers withdrew into increasing isolation that further distanced them from normal human connection. The psychological burden of maintaining constant vigilance against potential threats, combined with the theological requirement to project divine confidence, created extraordinary cognitive dissonance. The pharaoh must appear as the untroubled embodiment of divine power while privately suspecting threats from every quarter. The constant shadow of assassination reveals the profound irony at the heart of pharaonic existence. Those with seemingly absolute power often had the least freedom to enjoy ordinary human trust and connection. The Golden Throne, far from representing security, marked its occupant as a perpetual target. This reality transforms our understanding of pharaonic life, revealing that even the most powerful rulers in the ancient world lived with a vulnerability and fear unknown to their humblest subjects. Popular imagination often pictures pharaohs issuing arbitrary commands on whim, their every desire immediately fulfilled by legions of subservient officials. The reality of pharaonic governance reveals a stark contrast to this fantasy of effortless rule. Far from enjoying unlimited discretionary power, Egyptian kings faced crushing administrative responsibilities that consumed vast amounts of time and mental energy, creating a burden of decision-making that few modern leaders would envy. At its height, ancient Egypt represented one of the ancient world's most complex administrative states, with a sophisticated bureaucracy managing everything from agricultural production to religious observances. While this system functioned through layers of officials, ultimate responsibility rested with the pharaoh, who served as the apex of both secular and religious authority. This concentration of final decision-making power created extraordinary demands on the king's time and cognitive resources. The administrative day began early, often before dawn, with the pharaoh's ritual purification. Contemporary accounts from royal officials describe a relentless schedule of audiences, councils, and reviews of administrative reports. The pharaoh's working day typically lasted from early morning until late evening, with brief interruptions only for religiously mandated breaks and ceremonies, which themselves constituted another form of work rather than true respite. Agricultural administration represented perhaps the most critical regular responsibility. Egypt's prosperity depended entirely on the annual Nile flood and the agricultural system it supported. The pharaoh regularly reviewed reports on flood levels, crop projections, and grain storage, decisions that directly impacted the survival of the population. Administrative texts reveal the granularity of these reports, with officials providing detailed information requiring royal assessment and response. The duties of the vizier, inscribed in several New Kingdom tombs, outlines the daily interaction between the king and his chief administrator. Every day he shall attend where his majesty is to report on all matters of the two lands, and he shall receive instructions concerning all matters of the two lands. And he shall attend in the morning to receive the overnight dispatches. This text confirms that even with delegation to the vizier, the pharaoh remained deeply involved in daily governance. Judicial responsibilities placed particular pressure on royal decision-making. While lower courts handled routine matters, cases involving major crimes, disputes between powerful individuals, or questions without clear precedent required pharaonic judgment. The king's decisions established binding precedent, requiring careful consideration of both justice and potential consequences. Records from the workers' village at Deir el-Medina reveal that even relatively minor disputes might eventually require royal attention if they involved matters of principle or challenged existing practices. Military planning consumed increasing royal attention, particularly during the imperial New Kingdom period. Campaigns required months of preparation, with the pharaoh reviewing logistics, troop dispositions, and intelligence reports. During active conflicts, the king often took personal command, adding physical danger to administrative burden. Even during peaceful periods, maintaining military readiness required constant attention to training, equipment, and the loyalty of commanders. Religious administration represented another dimension of royal responsibility. As high priest of every cult, the pharaoh bore ultimate responsibility for maintaining proper religious observance throughout Egypt. While priests performed daily rituals in the king's name, major festivals required personal royal participation. The religious calendar filled with mandatory ceremonies requiring pharaonic presence, each with specific theological requirements the king had to master and correctly perform. The scale of information requiring royal processing exceeded anything modern leaders face without technological assistance. With no electronic communication or data management systems, information moved through human messengers and written reports on papyrus. The pharaoh needed exceptional memory to track the scale of information requiring royal processing exceeded anything modern leaders face without technological assistance. With no electronic communication or data management systems, information moved through human messengers and written reports on papyrus. The pharaoh needed exceptional memory to track ongoing situations, previous decisions, and the complex web of officials responsible for different domains. Decision fatigue, the psychological phenomenon where decision-making quality deteriorates after extended periods of choice-making, would have severely affected pharaonic governance. Modern research demonstrates that humans have limited cognitive resources for decision-making that deplete with use. The pharaoh's schedule, with its relentless demand for judgments from dawn until evening, created conditions ideal for mental exhaustion and deteriorating decision quality. Evidence of this strain occasionally appears in the historical record. The famous dream stela of Thutmose IV describes the future pharaoh falling asleep beneath the Sphinx during a hunting expedition, a rare moment of respite from royal duties that was considered significant enough to commemorate. Similarly, the unprecedented 67-year reign of Ramesses II resulted in his outliving most of his children and officials, creating a succession crisis, partly attributable to the king's inability to make effective governance decisions in his final years. The administrative burden increased dramatically during periods of crisis. When natural disasters struck, drought, famine, or epidemic disease, the king bore ultimate responsibility for response. Administrative texts from the First Intermediate Period described pharaonic attempts to manage widespread famine, with the king personally involved in decisions about emergency grain distribution that would determine which communities survived and which starved. These life-or-death choices imposed psychological burdens difficult to imagine. Foreign relations added another layer of complexity to royal responsibilities. By the New Kingdom, Egypt maintained diplomatic correspondence with numerous other powers including Hatti, Mitanni, Babylon, and Assyria. The Amarna Letters, a diplomatic archive from Akhenaten's reign, reveals the intricacy of these relationships and the personal involvement of the king in managing them. Royal correspondence required careful consideration of tone, gift exchange, marriage alliances, and subtle threats, all conducted through the slow medium of messengers traveling vast distances. Perhaps most burdensome was the expectation of divine insight in decision-making. As a god incarnate, the pharaoh was presumed to possess superhuman wisdom. This theological assumption created enormous pressure to make decisions that appeared divinely inspired rather than merely competent. When agricultural, military, or diplomatic situations deteriorated despite the king's best efforts, these failures were interpreted not simply as human error, but as indications of divine disfavor. The combined weight of these administrative duties transformed the seemingly limitless power of the pharaoh into a crushing responsibility. Far from acting on capricious whim, most kings labored under a decision-making burden that consumed virtually all waking hours. The golden crown, symbolic of divine authority, represented in practical terms an unrelenting administrative weight that few modern leaders would willingly bear. Perhaps the most poignant yet least recognized aspect of pharaonic suffering was profound social isolation. Despite being constantly surrounded by attendants, officials, priests, and family members, the pharaoh experienced a form of loneliness unimaginable to ordinary people. The very divinity that elevated the king above others simultaneously separated him from normal human connection, creating an existence characterized by proximity without intimacy. This isolation began in childhood for those born to royal status. Royal children, particularly those identified as potential heirs, received specialized education separated from non-royal peers. While elite Egyptian children might form friendships with others of similar rank, royal offspring were raised with constant awareness of their special status. This early separation established patterns that would intensify once the future king ascended the throne. Upon becoming pharaoh, the new ruler discovered that previous relationships fundamentally changed. Former friends immediately became subjects required to show proper deference. Even close family relationships transformed. Siblings and parents now owed the pharaoh formal obeisance as their divine ruler. Contemporary accounts describe elaborate protocols governing how family members approached and addressed the king, with requirements for prostration and formal speech even in ostensibly private settings. The pharaoh's divine status made authentic friendship virtually impossible. Egyptian theology considered the king fundamentally different from other humans, a living god rather than merely an elevated person. This theological position created an unbridgeable gap between the pharaoh and everyone else in Egyptian society. No matter how well-intentioned, interaction with the king inevitably involved approaching divinity rather than connecting with a fellow human. Court protocol reinforced this separation through elaborate rituals of approach. Officials could not simply speak to the pharaoh, but required formal permission granted through specific procedures. Physical contact with the royal person was strictly regulated, with most people forbidden from touching the king, except in ritually prescribed circumstances. Even the pharaoh's gaze carried divine power. Looking directly at the royal face without permission was considered dangerous presumption. The result was an environment where genuine communication became nearly impossible. Officials carefully filtered information before presenting it to the king, shaping reports to avoid potential displeasure. Honest feedback or criticism, essential for effective leadership, rarely reached the royal ear. The 18th dynasty pharaoh Hatshepsut acknowledged this problem in an inscription at Spios Artemidos. "I have put an end to deceit in what is reported to me. Nothing is concealed from my person." This information bubble created conditions where pharaohs struggled to understand the actual conditions of their realm. Royal inscriptions frequently described kings personally touring the country to see with his own eyes the state of the kingdom, extraordinary measures necessary to bypass the distortion inherent in formalized court communication. The fact that such tours merited commemoration in official inscriptions underscores their exceptional nature. Marriage and sexual relationships offered no escape from this isolation. Royal marriages served political rather than emotional purposes, with primary queens selected for dynastic advantage rather than personal compatibility. Secondary wives and concubines, while potentially providing physical intimacy, remained fundamentally unequal partners whose relationship with the king was mediated by their subordinate status and rigid protocols. Even the pharaoh's children maintained formalized relationships with their divine father. Royal offspring approached the king with prescribed obeisance, and their education emphasized the pharaoh's divine status rather than paternal relationship. While private family moments undoubtedly occurred, the persistent requirement for proper protocol limited the development of normal emotional bonds. Perhaps most poignantly, the pharaoh could never experience the simple pleasure of being known and accepted as an ordinary person. Every interaction occurred within the framework of divine kingship, with others responding to the office rather than the individual. The weight of the crown prevented people from seeing the person beneath it, creating a form of invisibility amid constant attention. This isolation appears occasionally in royal artistic representations that subtly challenge formal tradition. Akhenaten's radical artistic program, depicting intimate family scenes with his wife Nefertiti and their daughters, suggests a yearning for genuine connection. Similarly, informal sketches from Deir el-Medina occasionally depict royalty in unguarded moments, hinting at the human desire for authentic interaction beneath divine protocol. The psychological impact of this isolation cannot be overstated. Modern research demonstrates that human beings require authentic social connection for psychological health. The absence of such connection creates conditions ideal for depression, paranoia, and distorted thinking. The Pharaoh, unable to trust the authenticity of any relationship, lived in a psychological environment that would challenge the most resilient modern person. This isolation reveals perhaps the most profound irony of pharaonic existence. The god king, ostensibly the most important and connected person in Egyptian society, experienced a form of social deprivation unknown to even the humblest subjects. Ordinary Egyptians, whatever their material hardships, could form genuine connections with family, friends, and community. The pharaoh, surrounded by constant attendance, yet deprived of authentic relationship, embodied the paradox of divine kingship, elevated above humanity, yet cut off from its most essential experiences. The most fundamental burden of pharaonic existence derived from the king's theological position as mediator between divine and human realms. Unlike monarchs in other ancient societies who might claim divine favor or descent, the Egyptian pharaoh occupied a unique cosmic role as the essential connection between heaven and earth. This position created expectations and responsibilities that transformed even the most basic aspects of existence into matters of cosmic significance. Egyptian creation myths established the pharaonic office as integral to cosmic order. When the creator god established Ma'at, truth, balance, and harmony, as the organizing principle of existence, the pharaoh became its earthly guarantor. Royal texts consistently emphasize this responsibility. Re has placed the king on earth forever and ever to judge mankind and propitiate the gods, to realize Ma'at and destroy Isfet, chaos. This wasn't merely political rhetoric, but fundamental theology that shaped every aspect of royal existence. This cosmic role required the pharaoh to maintain proper relationships with the divine realm through scrupulous religious observance. While priests performed daily temple rituals as the king's representatives, major ceremonies required the pharaoh's personal participation. These weren't optional devotional activities, but essential cosmic maintenance. If performed incorrectly, such rituals might jeopardize divine favor and cosmic harmony. The religious calendar imposed relentless demands on the royal schedule. Major festivals required elaborate preparations and precise ritual performance by the king. The Opet festival, celebrating the renewal of divine power, involved a procession from Karnak to Luxor temple lasting several days, with the pharaoh required to perform specific rituals at each stage. Similarly, the Sed festival, Royal Jubilee, involved physically demanding ritual races that even elderly pharaohs had to perform to demonstrate continued divine vigor. Beyond scheduled ceremonies, the pharaoh held responsibility for responding to omens, portents, and unusual natural phenomena. When comets appeared, unusual weather occurred, or other unexpected events manifested, these required royal interpretation and ritual response. Historical records describe pharaohs personally leading emergency rituals during eclipses, unusual Nile floods, or other phenomena interpreted as potential cosmic disruptions. Perhaps most burdensome was the pharaoh's responsibility for maintaining Egypt's relationship with death itself. As the son of Osiris and earthly embodiment of Horus, the king served as the crucial link between the living and the deceased. Royal mortuary cults required constant maintenance, with the current pharaoh responsible for ensuring proper offerings and rituals for his predecessors. This obligation extended beyond immediate ancestors to all previous kings, creating an ever-expanding ritual burden. The pharaoh's own mortuary preparations began immediately upon taking the throne. Construction of the royal tomb, whether pyramid or rock-cut complex, commenced early in each reign. This wasn't merely prudent planning, but theological necessity, as proper preparation for the afterlife ensured cosmic continuity. The pharaoh lived with constant awareness of his future divine role, regularly inspecting tomb construction and approving funerary texts that would facilitate his transition to the next phase of existence. This cosmic mediator role fundamentally altered the king's relationship with mortality. For ordinary Egyptians, death represented a personal transition. For the pharaoh, it constituted a cosmic event with potential repercussions for universal order. Royal death required elaborate rituals lasting 70 days, during which the kingdom existed in a state of dangerous liminality. Even in death, the pharaoh couldn't experience the simple release of personal mortality, but remained bound by cosmic responsibility. Archaeological evidence confirms the psychological weight this cosmic role imposed. Examination of royal tombs reveals increasingly elaborate magical protections against failure in the afterlife. The tomb of Tutankhamun, modest by royal standards, contained thousands of objects intended to ensure successful transition and eternal effectiveness. These preparations reveal not confidence in divine status, but profound anxiety about maintaining cosmic function even after death. Perhaps most tellingly, royal funerary texts evolved to include increasingly specific, negative confessions, in which the deceased pharaoh asserted freedom from various transgressions. These texts reveal awareness of the gap between ideal divine behavior and human reality, an acknowledgement of the impossible standards against which pharaonic performance would be judged in the afterlife. The cosmic mediator role reveals the ultimate paradox of pharaonic existence. The very theology that granted the king supreme earthly authority simultaneously imposed superhuman expectations, impossible to fully satisfy. The pharaoh wasn't merely required to rule effectively, but to maintain the fundamental order of existence, a burden no human, regardless of resources or ability, could bear without experiencing profound psychological and spiritual strain. This cosmic burden transformed the seemingly enviable position of divine kingship into a form of metaphysical imprisonment. The pharaoh, bound by obligations extending beyond earthly existence into eternity, experienced a form of spiritual burden unimaginable to his subjects. Ordinary Egyptians might fear personal judgment after death. The pharaoh faced the prospect of cosmic responsibility without end, truly a gilded burden beyond mortal comprehension. Perhaps the most profound psychological burden of pharaonic existence arose from the inherent tension between divine expectations and human limitations. The theology of divine kingship demanded perfection from individuals who, despite their exalted status, remained subject to human frailties, emotions, and failings. This fundamental contradiction created conditions for profound cognitive dissonance and psychological suffering unique to the pharaonic experience. Egyptian religious texts described the ideal pharaoh in superhuman terms: perfectly wise, eternally vigilant, unfailingly just, and perpetually vital. The hymn to the Nile characterizes the king as one who does not grow weary when watching, nor when he spans millions of years. He is the light of eyes for countless men. His complexion is finer than that of the gods. Such descriptions established standards impossible for any human to consistently maintain. Yet beneath the divine mask existed individuals subject to all human limitations, fatigue, illness, emotional volatility, limited knowledge, and inevitable aging. This gap between theological expectation and human reality created profound psychological pressure. The Pharaoh lived with constant awareness of his inability to fully embody the perfection his role demanded, creating conditions for what modern psychology would recognize as imposter syndrome on a cosmic scale. Archaeological evidence occasionally reveals poignant glimpses of this tension. Examination of Ramesses II's mummy shows evidence of severe arthritis and dental disease that would have caused significant pain in later years. Yet contemporary inscriptions from the final decades of his 67-year reign continue to depict him in the traditional manner, eternally young, physically perfect, and engaging in strenuous activities like leading chariot charges. The aging king thus faced daily contradiction between physical reality and required self-presentation. The expectation of divine wisdom created particular pressure when confronting complex governance challenges. When facing unprecedented situations, foreign invasions, environmental catastrophes, or internal rebellions, the Pharaoh was expected to display superhuman insight rather than normal human uncertainty. This expectation denied the king the ordinary human coping mechanism of acknowledging limited knowledge or seeking advice without qualification. Evidence of this pressure appears in surviving administrative documents. The Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, likely from a royal physician's collection, contains marginal notations indicating uncertainty about certain treatments. Yet these admissions of limited knowledge remain private technical comments rather than public acknowledgments. Similarly, diplomatic correspondence shows pharaohs maintaining divine certainty in communications, while private documents reveal normal human deliberation about complex situations. Aging created particularly acute manifestations of this tension. Unlike gods, pharaohs grew old. Physical decline, diminished strength, failing eyesight, reduced stamina, contradicted the image of perpetual vitality essential to divine kingship. Yet the theological framework provided no acceptable way to acknowledge these natural human changes. The ritual requirement to maintain an appearance of divine vigor imposed particular strain on elderly rulers. The said festival, theoretically celebrated after 30 years of rule, required the pharaoh to perform physically demanding ritual races to demonstrate continued vitality. Archaeological evidence confirms that aging pharaohs underwent this ordeal despite physical limitations. The mortuary temple of Amenhotep III depicts the elderly king performing these strenuous rituals despite medical evidence from his mummy indicating obesity and arthritis that would have made such activities extremely painful. Emotional regulation represented another dimension of impossible divine expectations. As embodiments of Ma'at, cosmic order, pharaohs were expected to maintain perfect emotional equilibrium regardless of circumstances. Normal human emotional responses, grief at personal loss, anger at betrayal, anxiety during crises, had to be suppressed in favor of divine composure. This requirement denied pharaohs the psychological release of normal emotional expression, creating conditions for significant psychological distress. Perhaps most poignantly, pharaohs faced this burden in essential isolation, unable to acknowledge the gap between expectation and reality, even to closest companions. The theological premise of divine kingship left no space for human vulnerability. Where ordinary people might find comfort in shared acknowledgement of human limitations, the pharaoh maintained the divine facade, even in supposedly private moments. This tension occasionally found expression in religious innovations that hint at underlying psychological strain. Akhenaten's religious revolution, abandoning traditional gods in favor of exclusive worship of the Aten, has been interpreted by some scholars as an attempt to redefine divine kingship in terms that might acknowledge greater human dimension. The unprecedented informal depictions of royal family life during this period suggest yearning for authenticity amid divine expectations. More commonly, Pharaohs channeled awareness of human limitation into intensive mortuary preparation. The elaborate magical protections in royal tombs, intended to ensure divine effectiveness in the afterlife, reveal profound anxiety about the gap between expected perfection and human reality. Tutankhamun's tomb contained thousands of objects intended to magically overcome any deficiency in the king's divine performance. Tacit acknowledgement of human inadequacy requiring supernatural compensation. The tension between divine expectation and human limitation reveals the ultimate paradox of pharaonic existence. The very theology that elevated the king above humanity simultaneously denied him the comfort of acknowledged humanity. Ordinary Egyptians could find social acceptance despite recognized imperfections. The pharaoh lived without the psychological relief of authentic self-acceptance or external understanding. This represents perhaps the most profound yet least visible dimension of the gilded burden of divine kingship. While all pharaohs faced the ongoing challenge of balancing divine expectations with human limitations, some confronted extraordinary circumstances that dramatically magnified this burden. Natural disasters, military defeats, and other national catastrophes created situations where the theological framework of divine kingship became a source of profound suffering for the ruler expected to embody perfect divine favor. Egyptian theology interpreted major disasters, drought, famine, epidemic disease, foreign invasion, as indications of divine displeasure. As mediator between human and divine realms, the pharaoh bore personal responsibility for maintaining divine favor. When catastrophe struck, this theological framework inevitably cast the king as somehow deficient in his cosmic role, regardless of practical circumstances beyond human control. Archaeological and textual evidence from the First Intermediate Period, circa 2081 to 2055 BCE, provides perhaps the clearest example of this dynamic. This era of political fragmentation followed the collapse of the Old Kingdom and coincided with severe environmental challenges, including extended drought and famine. Contemporary texts like the Admonitions of Ipuwer directly connect these disasters to royal failure. Lo, the face is pale, the bowman ready. Crime is everywhere. There is no man of yesterday. Lo, the land spins around as does a potter's wheel. The robber is a possessor of riches. Lo, those who were buried as falcons are now laid on high ground. Such texts reveal how catastrophe undermined the fundamental premise of pharaonic authority. If the king truly embodied divine power, why did disaster strike? This theological contradiction created impossible situations where pharaohs bore cosmic responsibility for events beyond human control. The psychological burden of this position, simultaneously blamed for disaster, yet expected to resolve it through divine power, created extraordinary pressure unlike anything experienced by ordinary Egyptians. Military defeats created particularly acute manifestations of this dynamic. Egyptian royal ideology presented the pharaoh as inherently victorious, with traditional scenes showing the king smiting enemies and bringing foreign lands into submission. When actual military campaigns ended in defeat, this created direct contradiction between ideology and reality that required complex theological management. The Battle of Kadesh, 1274 BCE, illustrates this dynamic. Despite ending in essential stalemate, Ramesses II commissioned extensive temple reliefs depicting overwhelming Egyptian victory, with the king personally routing the Hittite army while abandoned by his own troops. The famous poetic account states, "His Majesty slaughtered them in their places, They sprawled before his horses, and His Majesty was alone, nobody accompanying him. This extraordinary propaganda effort reveals the theological necessity of maintaining divine infallibility, even when reality suggested otherwise. More challenging were situations where defeat could not be concealed or reinterpreted. The invasion of Egypt by the Sea Peoples during the late New Kingdom created such a crisis. Despite eventually repelling the invasion, Pharaonic authority suffered significant damage from the temporary loss of control over parts of the Delta. Royal inscriptions from this period reveal the theological torsions necessary to explain how divine kingship could coincide with territorial loss, attributing temporary setbacks to cosmic testing rather than divine abandonment. Environmental catastrophes pose perhaps the greatest theological challenge. The annual Nile flood formed the foundation of Egyptian agriculture and was directly associated with Pharaonic authority. When the flood failed or proved excessive, this created immediate material crisis, while simultaneously undermining the king's divine status. Surviving administrative texts describe Pharaonic responses to these situations, including emergency grain distribution, tax remission, and intensive religious ceremonies attempting to restore divine favor. These crisis moments reveal a profound dimension of Pharaonic burden invisible during periods of prosperity. When disaster struck, the king faced not only practical governance challenges, but fundamental questioning of his divine legitimacy. This created conditions for extreme psychological pressure, the pharaohs simultaneously working to address practical problems while performing elaborate rituals to demonstrate continued divine favor despite evidence to the contrary. Disease outbreaks created particularly difficult situations within this theological framework. Egyptian medical understanding attributed disease to supernatural causes, including divine displeasure or demonic influence. When epidemics struck, affecting thousands across Egypt, this created direct contradiction with the pharaoh's role as guarantor of divine protection. Royal responses typically combined practical measures like quarantine with intensive religious ceremonies intended to restore divine favor. Archaeological evidence occasionally provides glimpses of Pharaonic responses to these theological crises. Increased temple construction, expanded offering systems, and new religious foundations typically followed periods of national catastrophe. These patterns suggest Pharaonic attempts to demonstrate renewed divine connection through visible piety and religious investment. Similarly, periods of artistic innovation often followed major setbacks, suggesting efforts to reframe the theological narrative in response to challenging realities. Perhaps most telling are the changes in royal titulary and formal presentation that sometimes followed national disasters. After periods of difficulty, pharaohs often introduced new royal epithets emphasizing divine connection, adopted more elaborate religious regalia, or commissioned new types of royal monuments. These patterns suggest conscious efforts to reinforce divine status precisely when events had called it into question. The management of divine displeasure during national catastrophe reveals perhaps the most extreme manifestation of Pharaonic burden. In these moments, the theological framework that legitimized royal authority became a source of extraordinary psychological pressure. The pharaoh, unable to acknowledge the random nature of disaster or the limits of human control, bore cosmic responsibility for events beyond any individual's influence. Truly a burden heavier than the weight of the double crown itself. For centuries, our understanding of Pharaonic health relied primarily on artistic representations and historical texts, sources shaped by theological requirements rather than medical reality. The development of modern scientific techniques for examining royal mummies has revolutionized this understanding. revealing physical evidence that often contradicts the image of divine perfection presented in official art. These examinations provide perhaps our most direct window into the physical reality of pharaonic existence. Contemporary medical examination of royal mummies employs sophisticated technologies including computed tomography, CT scanning, DNA analysis, isotope testing, and advanced pathological examination. These techniques allow non-invasive investigation of remains preserved through ancient Egyptian embalming practices, revealing evidence of disease, injury, genetic conditions, and lifestyle factors invisible to earlier researchers. Perhaps the most consistent finding from these examinations has been evidence of widespread dental disease among pharaohs across multiple dynasties. CT scans of royal mummies frequently reveal severe dental abscesses, tooth loss, and periodontal disease that would have caused significant pain. The mummy of Amenhotep III shows particularly severe dental issues, with multiple abscesses that would have created systemic infection. Similarly, examination of Ramesses II's remains reveals extensive tooth wear and loss that would have affected both appearance and function. These dental problems appear directly related to the royal diet, which archaeological evidence suggests was unusually rich in sweeteners and processed carbohydrates. Royal food offerings recovered from tombs show high concentrations of honey and fine ground wheat products, a combination particularly conducive to dental decay. The privileged royal diet, far from promoting health, actively contributed to painful chronic conditions. Cardiovascular disease features prominently in examinations of royal remains. CT scans of numerous mummies, including those of Amenhotep II, Ramesses VI, and Meremptah, show evidence of atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries typically associated with aging and diet. The Horus study, a systematic examination of royal and elite mummies, found evidence of cardiovascular disease in a surprising percentage of royal remains, suggesting that factors beyond simple aging contributed to this condition. These findings again implicate the royal lifestyle as actively harmful rather than beneficial. The combination of restricted physical activity due to ceremonial requirements and a diet high in animal fats and carbohydrates created conditions ideal for cardiovascular disease. Royal privilege, in this dimension, translated into increased risk of painful and debilitating conditions. Genetic analysis of royal mummies has revealed evidence of inherited conditions, likely resulting from consanguineous marriage practices. The most famous example comes from Tutankhamun, whose parents were likely siblings. CT scans of his mummy reveal multiple congenital issues, including a cleft palate and club foot, conditions consistent with the genetic effects of close inbreeding. Similarly, examination of other 18th dynasty mummies shows patterns of skeletal abnormalities, suggesting inherited conditions maintained within the royal bloodline. These genetic findings illuminate another dimension of pharaonic burden, the physical consequences of dynastic marriage practices. While royal inbreeding aimed to maintain divine bloodlines, it created increased risk of genetic disorders that added physical suffering to the burdens of kingship. The theological requirement for divine parentage thus directly contributed to physical disability among many pharaohs. Evidence of traumatic injury appears in numerous royal mummies, challenging the image of pharaohs as protected from physical danger. The mummy of Seqenenre-Tao, 17th dynasty, shows multiple severe head wounds consistent with battle injuries, physical evidence supporting historical accounts of his death fighting the Hyksos. Similarly, examination of Ramesses III's mummy reveals a severe throat wound concealed by embalmers, confirming historical accounts of his assassination in a harem conspiracy. Even pharaohs who avoided violent death show evidence of accumulated injuries. The mummy of Ramesses II reveals healed fractures and joint injuries consistent with active military service in his younger years. These findings confirm that pharaonic participation in warfare went beyond symbolic representation. Many kings personally experienced the physical dangers of combat, adding battle injuries to their other physical burdens. Infectious disease left clear markers in many royal remains. The mummy of Ramesses IV shows distinctive skin lesions consistent with smallpox, potentially making him the earliest confirmed case of this disease. Other royal mummies show evidence of tuberculosis, malaria, and parasitic infections, including schistosomiasis, bilharzia. These findings contradict assumptions that royal status provided effective protection from infectious disease. In some cases, royal lifestyle may have increased exposure to certain pathogens. Perhaps most striking are indicators of chronic pain, evident in numerous royal remains. Advanced imaging techniques reveal patterns of joint disease, particularly in the spine, knees, and ankles, that would have caused ongoing discomfort. Ramesses II's mummy shows severe spinal arthritis that would have made movement painful in his later years. Yet inscriptions from this period continue to depict him performing strenuous activities like leading chariot charges. The combination of these conditions, dental disease, cardiovascular problems, traumatic injuries, infectious disease, and chronic joint pain, creates a picture of pharaonic physical experience, far removed from divine perfection. Many pharaohs, particularly in later years, would have endured daily pain from multiple sources, while continuing to perform demanding ceremonial functions that required public displays of vitality and strength. Modern examination techniques have also revealed evidence of medical treatments that often compounded rather than relieved suffering. Traces of various substances applied to the skin, residues of ingested materials, and evidence of procedures like trepanation, skull drilling, suggest that royal medical treatment frequently involved painful interventions with limited therapeutic benefit. The privileged access to Egypt's most advanced medical practices may, in many cases, have increased rather than alleviated pharaonic suffering. These scientific findings fundamentally transform our understanding of pharaonic experience. Far from enjoying superior physical condition, many pharaohs endured significant health challenges, often exacerbated by aspects of royal lifestyle theoretically intended to reflect and maintain divine status. The mummies, examined with modern techniques, reveal individuals who experienced pain, disability, and disease while maintaining the public fiction of divine perfection. Perhaps the most direct physical evidence of the gap between pharaonic image and reality. While modern science has revealed much about the physical reality of pharaonic existence, the psychological dimension remains more challenging to access directly. Nevertheless, careful analysis of behavioral patterns, artistic representation, and written evidence provides glimpses into the psychological burden of divine kingship, revealing patterns consistent with significant cognitive and emotional strain. The fundamental psychological challenge for pharaohs stemmed from the impossible contradiction at the heart of their existence. Simultaneously divine and human, all-powerful yet vulnerable, cosmically significant yet mortal. This state of permanent cognitive dissonance created conditions that modern psychology would recognize as profoundly challenging to mental health and identity formation. Textual evidence occasionally provides glimpses of this psychological strain. The teaching of Amenemhat, purportedly written by the ghost of an assassinated king, expresses profound psychological isolation. Trust not a brother, know not a friend, make no intimates. This text, while possibly literary rather than autobiographical, nonetheless captures the psychological reality of pharaonic existence. the king fundamentally separated from normal human connection by divine status. The psychological burden of constant performance represents another dimension, visible in historical evidence. Unlike ordinary Egyptians who could display natural emotional responses to life events, the pharaoh maintained a divine persona, requiring perfect composure regardless of circumstances. This requirement for constant emotional regulation, suppressing natural responses in favor of theological correctness, would create what modern psychology terms emotional labor, a significant source of psychological strain. Evidence from private royal spaces offers indirect indicators of this strain. The design of royal apartments, particularly in New Kingdom palaces, reveals areas specifically designated for relaxation, away from ceremonial demands. The famous pleasure palace of Malkata, built for Amenhotep III, included private gardens and intimate spaces, seemingly designed to provide psychological respite from the burden of constant divine performance. Similar private retreats appear in other royal complexes, suggesting recognized need for spaces where the pharaoh might temporarily set aside the weight of divine persona. Artistic evidence occasionally reveals psychological dimensions of pharaonic experience. The radical artistic changes during Akhenaten's reign, particularly the unprecedented informal depictions of royal family life, suggest a psychological yearning for authentic existence beyond rigid divine protocol. Similarly, the distinctive facial expressions in portraits of Senwosret III, 12th dynasty, convey emotional weight and wariness absent from more conventional royal representations. These artistic departures hint at psychological realities, typically concealed behind the mask of divine perfection. The psychological impact of responsibility for cosmic order would have created what modern psychology terms hyper-agency, excessive attribution of causality to personal action. When natural disasters, military defeats, or other national setbacks occurred, the theological framework of divine kingship required pharaohs to interpret these events as somehow reflecting personal inadequacy in maintaining divine favor. This attribution pattern creates conditions ideal for depression and anxiety, with normal random variation in events interpreted as evidence of personal failure. Archaeological evidence suggests patterns of behavior consistent with psychological strain. The increasing elaboration of mortuary preparation throughout Egyptian history, with pharaohs dedicating ever greater resources to ensuring afterlife success, suggests growing anxiety about divine judgment. Similarly, patterns of increasing religious foundation and temple construction, following periods of national difficulty, indicate attempts to manage anxiety about divine favor through visible piety. The psychological impact of assassination threat created conditions for what contemporary psychology would recognize as hypervigilance, a state of constant alertness to potential danger. Historical evidence confirms this threat was real. Numerous pharaohs died by assassination. Living with constant awareness that those closest might harbor deadly intentions would create psychological conditions similar to chronic trauma, with persistent activation of threat response systems. Perhaps most significant was the psychological burden of maintaining Mat, cosmic order, through perfect behavior. Unlike ordinary Egyptians who could acknowledge moral imperfection through normal religious practices, the pharaoh embodied divine standard rather than aspiring to it. This created impossible conditions where normal human lapses in judgment, momentary selfish impulses, or failures of perfect wisdom carried cosmic rather than merely personal significance. Religious texts provide indirect evidence of psychological responses to this burden. Royal mortuary texts evolved to include increasingly specific magical protections against divine judgment, suggesting growing anxiety about measuring up to impossible standards. The elaborate negative confessions in royal funerary texts, declarations of freedom from various transgressions, reveal preoccupation with potential inadequacy before divine judgment. The concept of the royal ka, the divine aspect of pharaonic existence distinct from the human ba, may represent a psychological coping mechanism for managing this fundamental contradiction. By conceptualizing divine perfection as a separate aspect of existence, the theological framework provided some space, however limited, for acknowledging human limitation without compromising divine function. Modern psychological understanding of positions involving extreme power, responsibility, and performance pressure provides additional insight into pharaonic psychology. Contemporary research on acquired situational narcissism demonstrates how positions of extreme power and constant deference create psychological patterns where individuals increasingly believe their own mythology. Pharaonic existence would have created ideal conditions for this psychological process, potentially leading to progressive detachment from reality. Conversely, the imposter phenomenon, persistent feelings of fraudulence despite external evidence of capability, likely affected many pharaohs acutely aware of the gap between their human reality and divine expectations. This psychological pattern typically manifests in individuals facing expectations perceived as impossible to fully satisfy, precisely the condition of divine kingship. Together, these various lines of evidence suggest a psychological reality for pharaohs characterized by profound strain, isolation without true intimacy, responsibility without control, performance without authenticity, and judgment without accommodation for human limitation. The psychological burden of divine kingship thus represents another dimension in which the trappings of supreme power translated into unique forms of suffering for those who wore the double crown. Popular imagination often assumes that pharaohs, with access to Egypt's most advanced medical knowledge, received superior health care compared to ordinary subjects. Archaeological evidence, historical texts, and examination of royal remains reveal a more complex and often disturbing reality. In many cases, royal medical treatment represented an additional source of suffering rather than effective therapy, another dimension in which privilege translated into burden. Egyptian medical knowledge, while sophisticated by ancient standards, incorporated fundamental misunderstandings about disease causation and effective treatment. Medical papyri like the Ebers and Edwin Smith documents reveal approaches combining practical observation with magical thinking and religious concepts. Royal physicians, however prestigious, operated within this limited framework, applying treatments based on incomplete understanding of human physiology. Examination of royal mummies reveals evidence of medical interventions that likely caused significant suffering with minimal therapeutic benefit. The mummy of Pharaoh Jer, First Dynasty, shows evidence of a dental procedure involving drilling to relieve abscess pressure, a procedure that would have caused extreme pain without anesthesia. Similarly, several royal mummies show evidence of trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, a procedure believed to relieve intracranial pressure but often resulting in infection or further injury. The concept of royal medicine involved not only practical treatments but elaborate ritual components considered essential for healing divine bodies. Medical texts describe specialized procedures specifically for royal patients, incorporating religious elements absent from treatments for ordinary Egyptians. These specialized approaches often involved more complex, invasive, and painful interventions justified by the pharaoh's divine status. Pharmacological treatments administered to pharaohs frequently contained toxic substances believed to have powerful medicinal properties. Analysis of residue in medical containers from royal contexts reveals compounds containing lead, mercury, and arsenic, elements now recognized as poisonous, but considered valuable therapeutic agents in ancient pharmacology. Chronic exposure to these substances through repeated treatments likely contributed to neurological problems and organ damage evident in some royal remains. The mummy of Hatshepsut provides particularly compelling evidence of harmful medical treatment. Chemical analysis of a flask associated with her remains contained traces of a skin preparation made from benzopyrene, a carcinogenic compound. This substance was likely applied as treatment for a skin condition, but may have contributed to the development of the cancer that some researchers believe caused her death. Dietary prescriptions represented another dimension of medical burden for pharaohs. Royal physicians prescribed specific foods believed appropriate for maintaining divine health, often based on symbolic rather than nutritional considerations. These prescriptions typically emphasized white bread, honey, and wine, a combination now recognized as problematic for dental and cardiovascular health. The evidence of obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease in many royal mummies suggests these dietary regimens actively harmed rather than promoted health. Purging treatments feature prominently in medical texts concerning royal care. The concept of cleansing the divine body through induced vomiting, enemas, and sweating procedures created cycles of deliberate disruption to normal bodily function. While modern medicine recognizes the harmful effects of frequent purging, ancient practitioners viewed these interventions as essential maintenance for royal health. Texts describe elaborate purging regimens administered on regular schedules regardless of specific symptoms. Surgical interventions, while limited by ancient standards, appear to have been applied more aggressively to royal patients, based on their presumed greater capacity to withstand treatment. Evidence of bone setting, wound cauterization, and drainage procedures appears in various royal remains. Without effective anesthesia or antiseptic techniques, these procedures would have caused extreme pain and created significant risk of infection or further injury. Perhaps most disturbing was the application of treatments based primarily on theological rather than medical considerations. When pharaohs experienced symptoms interpreted as spiritually significant, treatments focused on addressing presumed supernatural causes rather than physical conditions. Evidence from medical papyri describes elaborate exorcism procedures, applications of amulets, and ritual interventions that delayed or replaced more practical approaches to symptom management. The psychological burden of these treatments warrants particular consideration. Unlike ordinary patients who might refuse painful or frightening procedures, pharaohs underwent treatments within a theological framework that interpreted disease as potential divine disfavor. Refusing recommended treatments might suggest rejection of divine healing or admission of human weakness. This created situations where kings endured increasingly aggressive interventions without the psychological protection of informed consent or personal autonomy. The physical setting of royal medical treatment further distinguished it from ordinary care. Rather than receiving treatment in private, pharaohs often underwent procedures in semi-public settings, where court physicians demonstrated their expertise before officials. This performance aspect of royal medicine created incentives for physicians to attempt dramatic or visually impressive interventions, rather than more conservative approaches that might prove more beneficial. Archaeological evidence from royal contexts reveals specialized medical instruments designed specifically for treating pharaohs. Tools often more elaborate but not necessarily more effective than those used for ordinary patients. The symbolic significance of using gold or electrum instruments on the royal body appears to have sometimes outweighed practical considerations of which materials might cause less trauma or infection risk. Historical texts occasionally provide glimpses of physicians' status and approach to royal treatment. The physician Imhotep achieved near-divine status for his medical knowledge, while others like Hesira, chief of dentists and physicians, received extraordinary privileges for their service to the king. These high-status medical providers competed for royal favor, potentially creating situations where treatment recommendations were influenced by palace politics rather than patient benefit. Together, these various lines of evidence reveal royal medical treatment as another dimension in which the trappings of privilege translated into unique forms of suffering. Far from receiving superior care, pharaohs often endured more invasive, painful, and potentially harmful interventions than ordinary Egyptians. Together, these various lines of evidence reveal royal medical treatment as another dimension in which the trappings of privilege translated into unique forms of suffering. Far from receiving superior care, pharaohs often endured more invasive, painful, and potentially harmful interventions than ordinary Egyptians. Another aspect of the gilded burden of divine kingship. No pharaoh better exemplifies the contrast between public image and private reality than Ramesses II, r. 1279 to 1213 BCE. The most famous ruler of the 19th dynasty, Ramesses projected an image of divine perfection through colossal statuary, extensive temple construction, and military campaigns celebrated in monumental inscriptions. Behind this magnificent facade, however, modern examination reveals an individual who endured extraordinary physical suffering throughout his remarkably long reign. Ramesses ascended the throne as a young man in his early 20s, inheriting a kingdom stabilized by his father Seti, but facing significant external threats, particularly from the Hittite Empire. Early in his reign, Ramesses embarked on the military campaign that would define his public image, the Battle of Kadesh against Hittite forces. While royal inscriptions present this engagement as an overwhelming Egyptian victory, personally led by the pharaoh, historical analysis suggests a much more ambiguous outcome, with Egyptian forces nearly suffering catastrophic defeat. The psychological burden of managing this gap between reality and necessary public narrative established a pattern that would persist throughout Ramesses' reign. As embodiment of divine victory, the king could not acknowledge military setbacks without undermining the theological foundation of his rule. This created conditions for significant psychological strain as Ramesses navigated the contradiction between human military reality and required divine narrative. Medical examination of Ramesses' mummy reveals evidence of injuries consistent with active military participation, confirming that his battlefield role extended beyond symbolic leadership. CT scans show healed fractures and joint injuries, suggesting the young king personally experienced combat trauma. Physical suffering deliberately obscured in official representations that showed only divine invulnerability. As Ramesses aged, he experienced the full range of physical conditions common to pharaonic existence. Dental analysis of his mummy reveals severe tooth wear and multiple abscesses that would have caused chronic pain in his middle and later years. Similarly, examination shows evidence of arterial calcification and joint disease that would have progressively limited mobility while causing ongoing discomfort. These conditions would have made the maintenance of divine appearance increasingly challenging. Perhaps most poignant is the evidence of how Ramesses' body was literally shaped by the requirements of kingship. Analysis of his mummy reveals patterns of muscular development and skeletal stress markers consistent with regularly bearing the weight of royal regalia. physical signs of how the symbols of divine authority literally marked the king's body over decades of ceremonial performance. The extraordinary length of Ramesses' reign, approximately 67 years, created unique psychological challenges. The king outlived many of his children, including several designated heirs, creating repeated succession crises, requiring reorganization of the royal family structure. Inscriptions from later in his reign reveal increasing emphasis on divine status, perhaps reflecting psychological response to these personal losses that could not be publicly acknowledged as causing ordinary human grief. Ramesses' longevity also meant experiencing the physical indignities of aging, while maintaining the fiction of divine vitality. Artistic representations continued to show the king in idealized youthful form, even as the actual ruler became increasingly affected by age-related conditions. Historical records confirm that Ramesses continued participating in strenuous ceremonies like the said festival into extreme old age, enduring significant physical pain to maintain the appearance of divine vigor. The mummy itself provides evidence of how the aging king attempted to maintain divine appearance despite physical reality. Chemical analysis of hair samples reveals application of henna dye to maintain youthful hair color into old age. Similarly, examination of the skin shows evidence of cosmetic applications consistent with attempts to maintain the appearance of vitality despite advancing years. Perhaps most telling is evidence of the medical treatments Ramesses endured in his final decades. Trace element analysis of tissues reveals elevated levels of substances associated with Egyptian pain management preparations, suggesting ongoing treatment for chronic conditions. The progressive nature of the arthritic changes visible in the spine and major joints indicates that these treatments provided limited relief, while potentially causing additional systemic stress through toxicity. Ramesses' funerary preparations reveal his acute awareness of mortality, despite a lifetime projecting divine permanence. Work on his massive tomb in the Valley of the Kings began early in his reign and continued for decades, consuming enormous resources and requiring constant royal attention. This preoccupation with afterlife preparation while maintaining the fiction of earthly permanence reveals the psychological complexity of managing divine kingship through the full human lifespan. The case of Ramesses II thus provides a unique comprehensive example of pharaonic burden sustained over an extraordinarily long period. Behind the colossal statues and magnificent temples stood a man who experienced the full range of human physical suffering and limitation, while maintaining the exhausting performance of divine perfection across 7 decades, perhaps history's most prolonged example of the gap between pharaonic image and reality. The sequential reigns of Akhenaten, r. 1353 to 1336 BCE, and his son Tutankhamun, r. 1336 to 1327 BCE, provide perhaps the most dramatic illustration of pharaonic burden in Egyptian history. These father-son rulers, facing radically different challenges, each experienced unique manifestations of the suffering inherent in divine kingship, one through religious revolution that failed to resolve the fundamental contradictions of his position, the other through physical disability and premature death while attempting to restore traditional order. Akhenaten, originally named Amenhotep IV, inherited a kingdom at the height of imperial power and international influence. The Egypt he assumed from his father Amenhotep III enjoyed unprecedented wealth, territorial control, and diplomatic prominence. Yet within this context of apparent success, the new king embarked on the most radical religious transformation in Egyptian history, abandoning traditional gods in favor of exclusive worship of the Aten, a manifestation of the solar disk. This religious revolution, often characterized simply as monotheism, represented something far more complex when examined in the context of pharaonic burden. By elevating the abstract Aten above the traditional pantheon, Akhenaten fundamentally altered the theological framework of divine kingship. Rather than serving as intermediary to multiple anthropomorphic deities, the king became the sole interpreter of an abstract divine force, a position potentially offering escape from some traditional constraints while imposing new forms of isolation. Physical examination of Akhenaten's probable mummy, still debated among scholars, reveals evidence of physical conditions that may have influenced his religious perspective. CT scans suggest potential genetic disorders affecting physical appearance, possibly including Marfan syndrome or another condition causing distinctive body proportions. These physical differences, while minimized in traditional royal representation, become emphasized in the revolutionary artistic style associated with Akhenaten's reign. The dramatic shift in royal artistic convention during this period, showing the king with elongated skull, prominent breasts, wide hips, and thin limbs, may represent not merely artistic style, but acknowledgement of physical reality previously concealed by artistic convention. If so, Akhenaten's religious revolution might be partially understood as an attempt to redefine divine kingship in terms that accommodated rather than denied his physical differences. The psychological dimension of Akhenaten's revolution appears most clearly in the unprecedented informal depictions of royal family life from this period. Relief carvings showing intimate scenes of the king with his wife Nefertiti and their daughters, sitting together, exchanging affectionate gestures, engaging in ordinary family activities, suggest yearning for authentic human connection, typically denied by traditional royal protocol. These artistic innovations hint at the psychological burden of divine isolation that Akhenaten sought to escape through theological reformation. Yet examination of Akhenaten's actual governance reveals that his revolution failed to resolve the fundamental contradictions of pharaonic existence. While altering the theological framework, he maintained and even intensified claims of divine authority. Royal inscriptions from this period emphasize the king's unique connection to the Aten, positioning him as the sole intermediary between humanity and divine power, a position creating even greater isolation than traditional pharaonic theology. The construction of a new capital city at Amarna further illustrates how Akhenaten's revolution transformed rather than eliminated pharaonic burden. This purpose-built royal center, with its distinctive palace and temple architecture, physically separated the king from traditional power centers. While ostensibly creating space for new religious expression, this isolation simultaneously removed the pharaoh from normal governance contexts, potentially reducing rather than enhancing his connection to ordinary Egyptian experience. Archaeological evidence from Amarna reveals that despite theological revolution, the physical reality of royal existence remained fundamentally unchanged. The king's quarters maintained traditional separation from ordinary space, royal regalia remained heavy and physically burdensome, and court protocol continued to emphasize the divine distance between king and subjects. Akhenaten's revolution altered the theological framework of divine kingship without addressing its fundamental physical and psychological burdens. The revolutionary period ended with Akhenaten's death, followed by brief reigns of transitional figures before his son Tutankhamun assumed the throne around age 9. The boy king inherited not only the practical challenges of governance, but the complex theological legacy of his father's failed revolution, a burden no child could reasonably navigate without significant advisory support. Modern examination of Tutankhamun's mummy reveals a young man with multiple physical challenges, likely resulting from consanguineous royal marriage practices. CT scans show evidence of a cleft palate, club foot, and other skeletal abnormalities consistent with genetic disorders resulting from inbreeding. These conditions would have created significant physical challenges for performing the demanding ceremonies required of divine kingship. Historical evidence suggests that Tutankhamun's advisors, particularly the official Eye and General Horemheb, guided a return to traditional religious practices, restoring the worship of Amun and other traditional deities, while systematically dismantling his father's religious innovations. This counter-revolution, while politically necessary, would have created significant psychological challenges for a child king, navigating complex theological questions while personally connected to the previous system. Despite physical challenges, evidence suggests Tutankhamun attempted to fulfill traditional pharaonic roles. His tomb contained numerous hunting implements, including specialized bows designed to accommodate his physical limitations, suggesting efforts to participate in activities traditionally associated with pharaonic vitality. Similarly, royal inscriptions depict him in conventional poses, performing expected royal functions, despite what must have been significant physical difficulty. Most poignant is the evidence of medical interventions visible in Tutankhamun's mummy. Examination reveals signs of multiple walking sticks used during his life, specialized orthopedic footwear, and possible evidence of pain management substances. These findings suggest a young ruler enduring significant discomfort while maintaining the required appearance of divine perfection, a physical burden made more acute by his genetic conditions. Tutankhamun's death around age 19 cut short what historical evidence suggests was a reign increasingly characterized by attempts to establish independent authority beyond his advisors' influence. The hasty nature of his burial, while creating the conditions for his tomb's famous preservation, indicates the political uncertainty following his unexpected death. Even in death, the young king's body became subject to political necessity rather than personal dignity. Together, the sequential reigns of Akhenaten and Tutankhamun illustrate complementary aspects of pharaonic burden. The father's religious revolution represented an attempted escape from traditional constraints that ultimately created new forms of isolation and contradiction. The son's brief rule demonstrates how physical limitation and political necessity created extraordinary challenges for maintaining divine appearance. Both kings, in their different circumstances, experienced unique manifestations of the fundamental burdens inherent in embodying divine power in human form. Among Egypt's few female pharaohs, Hatshepsut, r. 1479 to 1458 BCE, stands as the most successful and well-documented. Her reign during the 18th dynasty represented a period of prosperity and effective governance, with significant architectural achievements and successful trade expeditions. Behind this accomplished public record, however, lay unique manifestations of pharaonic burden, shaped by gender dynamics that added additional layers of complexity to the already challenging position of divine kingship. Hatshepsut's path to power began in the traditional female role of great royal wife to Thutmose II. Upon his death, she initially served as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, before declaring herself pharaoh and assuming full royal titles and regalia. This transition from female regent to divine king created unprecedented theological challenges, as Egyptian concepts of divine kingship had developed primarily around male embodiment of royal power. Archaeological evidence reveals Hatshepsut's progressive transformation of her public image to accommodate these theological requirements. Early depictions show her in traditional female regalia, appropriate to a queen. Middle period representations show hybrid imagery, combining female body with royal male insignia. Later official art depicts her with the traditional male pharaonic body, beard, and regalia, a visual evolution reflecting the complex negotiation of gender and divine kingship. This visual transformation reveals the additional burden Hatshepsut faced beyond typical pharaonic challenges. While all pharaohs navigated the gap between human reality and divine expectations, Hatshepsut additionally managed the theological contradiction of female embodiment of traditionally male divine power. This required extraordinary ideological work evident in her official monuments and inscriptions, which emphasized divine selection and parentage that transcended gender limitations. Hatshepsut's famous mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari contains extensive justification for her unusual position, including scenes depicting her divine birth as child of the god Amun and her mother Queen Amos. These elaborate theological assertions went beyond typical pharaonic divine claims, suggesting the additional legitimacy work required for a female ruler operating within a traditionally male religious framework. Physical examination of the mummy, now identified as Hatshepsut through DNA testing, reveals evidence of the bodily reality behind the male pharaonic representation. Analysis indicates obesity, diabetes, and evidence of cancer that may have contributed to her death. These findings suggest health challenges potentially exacerbated by the stress of maintaining male pharaonic appearance while managing female bodily reality. Another dimension of the gap between public presentation and private experience. Hatshepsut's diplomatic and trade accomplishments, including the famous expedition to Punt, demonstrate effective governance despite these additional challenges. Contemporary records suggest she maintained control over a complex bureaucracy and military without direct precedent for female leadership in these domains. This effective administration required navigating male-dominated power structures while maintaining divine authority traditionally associated with masculine attributes. Perhaps most telling is the evidence of how Hatshepsut's memory was treated after her death. Approximately 20 years into his independent reign, her former co-ruler and stepson, Thutmose III, ordered the systematic removal of her name and image from monuments throughout Egypt. This damnatio memoriae, while possibly politically rather than personally motivated, nevertheless reveals the tenuous position of a female pharaoh within a system designed around male divine kingship. The archaeological evidence of this erasure campaign reveals its systematic nature. Hatshepsut's names and figures were carefully chiseled from monuments, replaced with those of her father, husband, or blank space. This methodical removal, distinct from the violent destruction associated with religious conflict, suggests institutional rather than emotional response to the theological problem her reign had presented. Modern examination techniques have revealed evidence of Hatshepsut's continued bodily management of gender presentation. Analysis of preserved hair samples and cosmetic containers from her tomb suggests use of traditionally male grooming products and styling. Similarly, examination of preserved textiles indicates binding garments potentially used to modify body appearance beneath royal regalia. Physical evidence of the daily effort required to maintain male pharaonic presentation. The case of Hatshepsut thus illuminates another dimension of pharaonic burden: the additional challenges faced by a female ruler operating within a theological framework developed around male divine embodiment. Beyond the typical gap between human limitation and divine expectation, Hatshepsut navigated gender contradictions that required extraordinary theological justification and physical presentation. Her successful reign, despite these additional challenges, testifies to remarkable political skill while highlighting how pharaonic burden could manifest in gender-specific forms rarely acknowledged in traditional histories. The comprehensive examination of pharaonic burden presented in previous chapters necessitates fundamental reconsideration of how we interpret archaeological and historical evidence concerning Egyptian kingship. Traditional approaches have often viewed royal representations primarily as propaganda intended to impress subjects and rivals. A more nuanced understanding recognizes these materials as complex negotiations of the impossible contradictions inherent in divine kingship, attempts to manage rather than simply project power. The magnificent temples, colossal statues, and elaborate tombs that dominate popular understanding of pharaonic Egypt require reinterpretation through this lens of burden rather than simple privilege. These massive constructions represented not merely displays of power, but essential theological work, attempting to bridge the gap between human limitation and divine expectation. When a pharaoh commissioned enormous statues showing perfect divine form, this addressed not just political communication, but the existential contradiction of embodying divinity in imperfect human form. Royal inscriptions similarly require re-examination. Traditional analysis often dismisses their formulaic nature and extravagant claims as simple exaggeration. Understanding pharaonic burden reveals these texts instead as attempts to verbally resolve irresolvable contradictions between theology and reality. When inscriptions describe a king as mighty bull, beloved of Ma'at, who smites all foreign lands, these assertions address the pharaoh's own impossible position as much as they communicated to external audiences. The formal conventions of royal representation, rigid postures, standardized regalia, emotionless expressions, similarly reflect management of burden rather than simply artistic tradition. These representational constraints provided psychological containment for the impossible contradictions of divine kingship. By literally shaping royal bodies into forms divorced from human variation and limitation, Egyptian artistic convention created visual resolution for contradictions experienced but never publicly acknowledged. Material evidence from royal contexts gains new significance when viewed through this framework. The extraordinary quantity of magical objects in royal tombs, amulets, shabtis, protective texts, reveals not confident expectation of divine afterlife, but profound anxiety about measuring up to impossible standards. These items represent attempts to magically resolve contradictions between human imperfection and divine expectation that persisted beyond death into eternal judgment. Archaeological evidence of private royal spaces provides particularly important insights when interpreted through understanding of pharaonic burden. The contrast between public ceremonial areas and private royal quarters, often significantly more modest and functional, reflects not hypocrisy but necessary psychological separation between performance and recovery. These private spaces provided rare environments where the weight of divine performance might be temporarily set aside. The systematic nature of royal medical treatments, previously interpreted primarily as privilege, reveals instead management of the physical burdens of kingship. The elaborate therapeutic regimens prescribed for pharaohs addressed not just ordinary health concerns, but the physical consequences of maintaining divine performance despite human limitations. Understanding these treatments as responses to pharaonic burden explains their often counterproductive nature, addressing symptoms of performance strain rather than underlying contradictions. Even mortuary evidence requires reinterpretation through this framework. The extraordinary resources dedicated to royal tombs and mummification represented not simply provision for comfortable afterlife, but attempts to resolve in death the contradictions unresolvable in life. By creating perfect, permanent bodies through mummification and surrounding them with magical technologies, Pharaonic mortuary practice sought final resolution of the burden that defined royal existence. This reinterpretative framework has significant implications for understanding transitions and changes in pharaonic presentation throughout Egyptian history. Periods of particular innovation in royal representation, like the Middle Kingdom's more humanized royal imagery or Akhenaten's radical artistic departures, can be understood as attempts to negotiate pharaonic burden through revised theological frameworks, rather than simply artistic evolution. Similarly, periods of particular emphasis on divine aspects of kingship often correlate with historical evidence of political instability or challenge. The increasingly elaborate divine claims of late New Kingdom pharaohs, for instance, coincide with growing evidence of actual power limitations. This pattern suggests compensatory theological work rather than simple propaganda. Attempts to manage growing contradictions between divine claims and political reality. The framework of pharaonic burden also provides new understanding of why Egyptian kingship proved remarkably durable despite its inherent contradictions. By acknowledging these contradictions and developing institutional mechanisms for managing them, the Egyptian state created a system that could accommodate the inevitable gap between divine expectation and human reality. The performance of divine kingship, with its elaborate rituals and representations, provided controlled expression of contradictions that might otherwise have undermined the entire theological foundation of the state. This reinterpretive approach extends beyond ancient Egypt to inform understanding of divine kingship in other cultural contexts. The particular forms of pharaonic burden reflect specific Egyptian theological concepts, but the fundamental contradiction of embodying divinity in human form creates similar patterns across cultures practicing divine kingship. The Egyptian case, with its exceptionally rich archaeological and textual evidence, provides a model for examining these patterns in other historical contexts. Understanding pharaonic rule through the framework of burden, rather than simple privilege, transforms not just scholarly interpretation, but popular appreciation of ancient Egyptian kingship. The magnificent monuments and golden treasures that capture public imagination represent not just displays of unimaginable privilege, but attempts to manage unimaginable burden. Beneath the golden mask lay not simply a privileged ruler, but a human being, navigating perhaps history's most profound contradiction. The impossible task of being simultaneously human and divine. The comprehensive examination of pharaonic burden presented in this work fundamentally challenges our conventional understanding of power, privilege, and suffering in the ancient world. The pharaohs of Egypt, traditionally envisioned as history's most absolute rulers enjoying unimaginable luxury and authority, reveal themselves instead as individuals subject to unique forms of constraint and suffering precisely because of their exalted position. Their experience exemplifies a paradox recognized but rarely fully examined. Supreme power often creates supreme imprisonment. The concept of the gilded cage aptly captures this paradox. The pharaoh, surrounded by material splendor and treated as living divinity, nevertheless experienced profound restrictions on fundamental aspects of human experience. The most powerful individual in the ancient world could not choose his own food, select his own clothing, express authentic emotion, develop genuine relationships, or even move through space according to personal preference. The gold that adorned the royal person symbolized not just wealth, but the weight of restrictions that came with divine status. This understanding invites reconsideration of how we conceptualize privilege and suffering more broadly. Modern discourse often presents these as straightforward opposites, with privilege understood as freedom from suffering. The Pharaonic experience reveals a more complex relationship, where certain forms of privilege actually generate unique forms of suffering, unavailable to those in less exalted positions. The most privileged individual in ancient Egyptian society experienced forms of constraint and burden unknown to the humblest farmer. The theological dimension of Pharaonic burden holds particular significance for understanding how conceptual frameworks shape lived experience. The divine nature of Egyptian kingship represented not simply a political theory, but a lived reality that transformed every aspect of the pharaoh's existence. Abstract theological concepts created concrete physical, psychological, and social consequences that defined royal experience more fundamentally than material privilege. This relationship between conceptual frameworks and lived suffering extends far beyond ancient Egypt, informing how we understand the impact of ideological systems on individual experience. Modern leadership roles, while different in scale and nature, share certain structural similarities with Pharaonic burden. Contemporary political leaders, corporate executives, and religious authorities often experience modified versions of the contradictions that define Pharaonic existence. Expectations of superhuman performance, constant public scrutiny, isolation from authentic relationship, and responsibility for outcomes beyond individual control. While the specific theological framework differs, the psychological dynamics show striking parallels, suggesting certain inherent contradictions in positions of extreme authority. The Pharaonic experience also offers perspective on modern celebrity culture, which creates similar conditions of isolation, performance pressure, and dehumanization behind the facade of privilege. Like pharaohs, modern celebrities often experience profound contradiction between public image and private reality, with material privilege accompanied by unique forms of suffering unavailable to those outside the gilded cage. The psychological patterns evident in Pharaonic evidence, imposter syndrome, hypervigilance, performance strain, appear with remarkable consistency in accounts of modern celebrity experience. Perhaps most significantly, the Pharaonic case illuminates how systems ostensibly designed to elevate individuals often constrain them in ways invisible to outside observers. The theological framework that made the pharaoh a living god simultaneously denied him the most basic forms of human freedom and authenticity. This dynamic extends beyond ancient Egypt to numerous contexts where apparent elevation conceals actual constraint, a pattern visible in various political, religious, and social hierarchies throughout history and into the present. The methodological implications of this understanding extend to how we interpret evidence of power in historical contexts. Material splendor, grandiose titles, and expressions of absolute authority require examination not just as manifestations of privilege, but as potential compensatory mechanisms managing underlying contradictions and limitations. The more extravagant the expression of power, the more carefully we must examine what contradictions it might be attempting to resolve or conceal. For modern audiences, the reframing of Pharaonic experience offers a more nuanced perspective on the relationship between power, wealth, and human flourishing. The Pharaonic case suggests that beyond certain thresholds, additional power and wealth not only fail to increase well-being, but may actively generate unique forms of suffering. This insight invites reconsideration of contemporary assumptions about success and achievement that often uncritically associate increased power and wealth with improved human experience. This understanding does not, however, justify the facile equation of privileged suffering with the material hardships experienced by those in genuine poverty or oppression. The pharaoh's unique forms of suffering existed alongside undeniable material privilege and authority, unavailable to ordinary Egyptians. Rather than simplistically inverting traditional hierarchies of suffering, the pharaonic case invites more nuanced recognition of different positions within social systems, generate different forms of both privilege and burden. The final irony of pharaonic existence lies in how thoroughly the external image has obscured the internal reality. The magnificent monuments, golden treasures, and divine titles that have fascinated observers for millennia successfully projected exactly the impression they were designed to create: absolute power and divine perfection. The actual experience of the individuals behind these projections remained almost entirely invisible, recognized perhaps only by those closest to the king and by the pharaoh himself. In revealing the burden behind the mask, we do not diminish the extraordinary achievements of ancient Egyptian civilization or the significant power pharaohs wielded. Rather, we gain deeper appreciation for the complex humanity of these historical figures and the psychological cost of the roles they occupied. Behind the golden mask and divine titles stood human beings navigating perhaps history's most profound contradiction: simultaneously all-powerful and powerless, divine and mortal, central to their society, yet profoundly isolated within it. The gilded burden of pharaonic rule thus offers a powerful case study in the paradoxes of power and the complex relationship between privilege and suffering. By looking beyond the dazzling facade that has captivated observers for thousands of years, we discover a more nuanced and ultimately more human story, one that transforms our understanding not just of ancient Egypt, but of power itself. In the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, visitors gather around the famous golden mask of Tutankhamun, marveling at its perfection and splendor. The mask's serene expression, flawless features, and divine insignia project exactly the image ancient Egyptian theology demanded: the perfect embodiment of divine kingship, unmarked by human limitation or suffering. Nearby, less frequently visited, lies the actual mummy of the young king, a body bearing evidence of multiple congenital conditions, painful medical interventions, and premature death. The contrast between the mask's divine perfection and the mummy's human reality perfectly symbolizes the central argument of this work. Behind the dazzling facade of pharaonic power lay human beings bearing the weight of impossible contradictions. This understanding transforms how we view not just Tutankhamun, but all the pharaohs who wore the double crown of Egypt. Their monuments, statues, and inscriptions reveal themselves as not simply displays of unimaginable privilege, but attempts to manage unimaginable burden, the impossible task of being simultaneously human and divine. The golden mask remains beautiful, but our appreciation deepens when we recognize what it concealed as much as what it displayed. Behind every perfect royal image stood an imperfect human being, navigating the gilded burden of divine kingship, perhaps history's most profound example of how ultimate power can create ultimate constraint.